I'd like to say there's a general perception that the gap between the rich and the poor is apparently and quite conspicuously widening worldwide. So what went wrong despite all the efforts to solve this problem?
Many people talk about inequality and they measure it, but they don't explain it. And the reason for inequality is debt. More people are more and more deeply in debt, and more corporations are in debt. Corporations are in debt because corporate raiders or investors can borrow money at a very low interest rate, and they can buy companies that are paying a dividend rate of, say, 8 or 9 or 10%. So if you can borrow at 4%, you can buy a whole company that pays 10%, and you can make the difference is a kind of arbitrage. So companies that are financialized, that are taken over, companies whose managers are paid in stock options for raising the price, say, well, we're now going to use our earnings. We're not going to invest in new factories and new plant and equipment because that takes a long time to produce earnings and the market isn't there anyway. We're going to use our profits to buy back our stock. As a manager in stock options, I'm paid by how much I increase the company's stock for the stockholders. So basically, the banks gain by making more and more takeover loan interest, and stockholders gain to buy a stock that's going up in price, not because a company's producing more, not because it's earning more, but simply because it's buying up its own stock. Well, meanwhile, people are going more and more in debt. It's hard, I think, for Germans to realize how deeply in debt Americans are for their housing. Right now, the U.S. government guarantees mortgage loans made that absorb up to 43% of the borrower's income. Now imagine paying 43% of your income. Imagine if the Germans had to pay that high a proportion for rent. They wouldn't have money to spend on goods and services. It would squeeze the market. Well, over and above the 43% that families pay for income, all this is guaranteed by the government. If they go wrong, the banks don't lose. They have to pay student loans. In America, people may spend 10%, even more on student loans. So that's a big chunk of their income. The wages in America, before you get the wages, 15% and more is taken out for Social Security and health care. And then other bank loans have to be paid, credit card interest, auto loans, and taxes, maybe 10 or 15% above that. Income taxes, local taxes, and excise taxes. So the average paycheck in America that a family actually can spend on consumer goods, on goods and services, on food and clothing and transport is only about 20% of their income. And it's shrinking because they have to break even by borrowing more and more of their credit card debt. More and more interest and amortization has to be paid to the banks. And if markets are shrinking, why would companies invest more in plant and equipment? So investment is falling, consumption is falling, and the banks say, well, we're going to be in trouble because people can't afford to buy houses, they can't afford to repay their loans. So the Federal Reserve is doing what the European Central Bank does. It says, well, we'll lend you credit at 0%, and you can simply keep lending money to try to push up housing prices all the more. Now, in America, people think that when housing prices go up, the economy gets richer. But what it really does is it gets more and more in debt. When people borrow more to buy a house, they can afford to outbid other rival buyers and raise the house price. But what that means, every time housing prices go up, people have to pay more and more of their income for it and have less and less to spend in the economy. That's what makes Germany so competitive. You have low rents here, Until now, you've had low housing prices, so you have a competitive advantage over the United States. The United States Treasury talks to the European Central Bank and says, you must make Europe more uncompetitive. We don't want Europe as a competition. We want you to flood the economy with credit. We want you to make European labor as expensive as American labor so that you will not be in competition with American firms and producers. And we also don't want you to invest in Ukraine, Russia. Leave that to us. We will invest in Ukraine and Russia. You must impose sanctions on it. We're the unique economy, the indispensable economy, so we don't have to obey our sanctions, but you have to obey our sanctions. So essentially, Europe is following a policy that is made in Washington and New York and Wall Street that is making the economy less than competitive. And at the end of this whole road, lies Greece. If you want to see why Europe is becoming more and more uncompetitive, look at what is happening in Greece or even in Latvia or other countries that are looked at as the ideal when you let the financial planners take over. This is the kind of economy that they plan. It's an economy to make the financial sector richer and the real estate sector richer, but it's not going to make the industrial economy richer. So I think in Germany, the question is, do you want to be an industrial economy or do you want to be a finance and real estate economy? You have a choice. And this choice is not being spelled out. And if people knew that that's the choice, I think they'd be following policies that helped Germany much more than that helped American bankers.
Well, in your new book, Michael, you say, and you pay a lot of attention to the achievements of capitalism as well. And at the same stage, as you pointed out, something went terribly wrong. So apparently capitalism failed to meet its objectives. And you argue even in your book that the original concept of capitalism has changed over the time. So how and when was it transformed?
Well, what is capitalism? There are many kinds of capitalism. Most people think of industrial capitalism, of factories hiring labor to produce more goods and services, and they spend their wages on buying what they produce. But there's not only industrial capitalism. After about World War I, the world moved into finance capitalism, where people made money, and most of the people who get rich in the financial markets. You don't get rich by actually producing more. That was how the industrial capitalists did it. That's how Germany got rich for many years. But now, if you look at the Forbes 100 list of the richest people in every country, well, the main way to get rich is what Balzac said, by theft. Behind every great fortune is a great theft, usually undiscovered. The main way of theft is by being a political insider. So if you look at China and Russia, the richest people there are political insiders that gave away public property to themselves and got rich. The next richest people are monopolists who have privatized natural infrastructure, like Carlos Slim in Mexico and people who own monopolies here, bankers, and real estate speculators who borrowed all who borrow money from the banks to buy building, and the banks will put more and more money into the real estate market, pushing up real estate prices. So they're speculators who've ridden a financial credit rise that's loaded the economy down with debt, but has made the financial sector richer. There are fewer and fewer industrialists. You won't find anyone in the Russian list of the wealthiest people who've actually built factories. They've taken over Soviet factories, but mostly they've taken over oil, gas, electric utilities, mining, aluminum, which is made out of electricity. The Americans now are trying to say that Ukraine is corrupt, so sell us your farmland, sell us your electric utilities, sell us your gas trading rights, and none of this actually produces goods and services. It's not a production economy. It's basically finance capitalism. And after finance capitalism, you have the bubble economy. You have Pentagon capitalism. Under industrial capitalism, the idea is that companies will win more customers by lowering the price of production, by innovating, by technology, by raising productivity and lowering prices. That's not how military Pentagon capitalism works in the United States. They have what's called cost-plus agreements, and that means a company will, the U.S. government, if it's buying a military aircraft, will say, we will reimburse your costs and give you 10% profit. So the objective of a military supplier like Boeing or the others is to make as expensive an airplane as possible, expensive electricity. They will over-engineer. The engineers will see how sophisticated and expensive can we make this. Well, what happened after the Pentagon capitalists did this in America in the 1960s for electronics, for aircraft, the Japanese and the Koreans came in and they said, well, we're going to make consumer goods. Instead of making the most expensive product we can to make profit, we're going to make the least expensive product we can and sell it at a profit and make industrial profit. So right there you have an example of the contrast between Pentagon capitalism and industrial capitalism. On Wall Street, you have various other forms. You have casino capitalism, where a company, since 2008, banks have been able to borrow from the Federal Reserve in the United States or in Europe from the European Central Bank money at zero interest. What have they done? They've basically made bets on mathematical derivatives. They bought foreign exchange, foreign currency. They've bought foreign bonds yielding high prices, like between 2008 and 2010, they bought Greek bonds yielding much higher prices. And then when the Greeks couldn't pay, the European Central Bank came in and, with the IMF and lent money to Greece to buy all the bonds that bondholders pay them in full, so that they made a killing by the European Central Bank. Now, this is at a time when employment was declining in Greece and Southern Europe. The European Central Bank didn't do what a real central bank does, which is finance government spending into the economy to revive employment, to help bring the economy out of recovery. The European Central Bank only makes money to banks to make more money to compensate for the bad loans they made by acting recklessly as if somehow the finance capitalism system would work instead of run into a dead end.
How does this new mode of capitalism really affect our individual lives, really, I mean, the lives of everyone, of each of us, really?
When you say how does the current economic situation affect everyone, you have to break down the population. Youth is different from the elderly. All over America, also in Greece, they've extended the retirement age. They've said you're not going to get pensions as early as you thought because we've lost our money on Wall Street. I'm sorry, we can't afford to pay the pensions. You've got to stay in the workforce longer. So the elderly are staying in the workforce much longer in countries where the retirement age is raised. That means that young people, there are no jobs for young people because there are only so many jobs that are required to produce. And so young people have great difficulty getting into the labor force. 70% of professors in the United States are part-time. That means when you get a PhD, you'll be able to make only maybe $2,000 a year per course, a whole year, and you only get $2,000 as an adjunct professor, part-time, because universities can make money that way. Well, meanwhile, you've taken out student loans that may cost $150,000, $200,000, so you have to pay student loans. The average rent in New York City is $4,500 a month. So just imagine, you'll have to pay a few $100, maybe $500 a month on student loan. How are you going to live when you only make $2,000 or $4,000 a year? The answer is you live at home with your parents. So in the United States, you have more and more people in their 20s living at home with their parents. 10 million Americans had their houses in foreclosure after the real estate crisis of 2008. And you had funds come in all of a sudden, like Blackstone funds would come in and buy thousands and tens of thousands of these homes under foreclosure. They would buy them and then they would begin to rent them, raising the rates. And so you had a shift from owner-occupied housing to absentee ownership.
It's a very interesting point, Michael. You are using the term war and warfare in this context, of course, to describe the way bankers are acting today. And it's clear, I mean, you made their intentions clear as well. But to use another metaphor of yours, can't the bankers, i.e. the parasites, really realize that they are, in the end, not only killing their hosts, but eventually themselves?
There's always a symbiosis between hosts and parasites. A smart parasite will keep the host alive and growing and reproducing so that there can be more hosts for the parasite. But a self-destructive parasite in nature will actually just take so much from the host that it kills the host and then lay eggs in it, and the eggs will destroy the host's body. And what you have in finance is not the intelligent parasite of nature that lives in the long run of helping the host population increase. Finance lives in the short run. It doesn't have, it's a hit and run. Until World War I, Germany was the country above all that had a long-term industrial finance. Germany and Central Europe was the only area of the world whose banks would actually lend to create factories, to build factories, and take a long-term views. And most of the great German industrial companies had bankers on their boards, and the banks would not only lend money to the companies, they'd be stockholders in the companies. They'd have an equity share. They worked with the companies, very productive. That is what fueled Germany's industrial revolution leading up to World War I and made the country so prosperous.
Your new book and the German edition of your new book is called Der Sektor.
Yes.
Yeah, which you call in English, we call it the fire sector. So what exactly do you mean by sector? And above all, how could the sector have to become so powerful?
In the United States, national income economists realize that finance, insurance, and real estate are not part of the industrial economy. They're part of overhead. They make money from the industrial economy, so the statistics separate finance, insurance, and real estate into what's called the fire sector, Finanz, Versicherung und Immobilien. You can overdo it. They realize that this is where all of the wealth is being sucked up into. If you look at almost every country, but especially the United States, all of the wealth has been, the growth in income doesn't accrue to the 99% of the population that are employees that make goods and services or work. They've all accrued to the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. And this is the sector that essentially creates the money, that manages the money, that owns the real estate, and runs the health insurance. Health insurance costs have risen at 15% per year in the United States, very, very fast. Rental costs have been rising 10% a year. There's been a huge inflation in the prices that people have to pay for housing, the prices people have to pay for insurance, increase in what they have to pay the banks. But actual wages have gone down. And that means that while wages are going down, people have to pay more and more money to finance, insurance, and real estate. That means there's less and less ability to buy goods and services. Already in the 1930s, a new term was created, and that was debt deflation. The more debt people have to pay, the less they have to pay on goods and services, so prices for consumer goods go down. So what you've seen since 2008 has been consumer prices drifting down or remain constant in the United States and in Europe, real estate prices going up, insurance rates going up, and finance, stock market going up, and the bond market going up. So you have two divergent economies. The fire sector is not part of the overall industrial economy. It's separate from it, and it makes its money from the industrial economy. And you could say, as my friend David Graeber does, that the 1% get rich by holding the 99% in debt to them. And that's what explains the inequality in today's world. The 99% are paying more interest and rent and financial penalties to the banks, insurance industry, and real estate.
Do have politicians any influence whatsoever on this sector? And what can and ought to be done to re-establish the primacy of politics and of democracy and of the true interests of the people?
It's very difficult to see what can be done because the economy drive to become like Greece cannot be stopped until you write down the debts. This is the problem that people are not willing to realize, that you can either save the economy or you can save the bankers and bondholders. And the bankers and bondholders really dominate the media, they dominate the schools, they give subsidies to the business schools and the economics departments to teach that you can't cancel the debts. But actually, if you look through history, every society has had to cancel the debts in one way or another. The German economic miracle really was the Allied monetary reform of 1947, when all German internal debts were canceled, except for minimum working balances in the bank accounts, and except for the money that German employers owed their workers. That was a debt, it's a payroll debt. But Germany was able to start its economic miracle debt-free. Right now, that's called unthinkable. So you could say that my book is about thinking about the unthinkable.
Still, I want to ask you what comes next, because you have been not only one of the few economists who predicted the financial crisis, but also, I believe you were the first to forecast the real estate collapse. And so I was wondering, if we go on like that, don't you think that we have to expect a revolution even?
Well, I have to be more modest. You say that it's true that the Financial Times cited me as one of the first, along with my friend Steve Keen, to forecast the crisis. But that's because I was, in addition to teaching, I was a popular journalist in America, and I wrote a cover story for Harper's Magazine saying exactly what would happen. Already in the 1970s, I was called Dr. Doom. But the fact is, at the time I wrote my article for Harper's, 2 years before the crisis, the English language already was referring to liar's loans, fake junk mortgages. They were already talking about ninjas. All of Wall Street and all of the investment community knew that the economy was based on financial fraud. Economists didn't teach this in the textbooks. And because I was an economics professor, and because I wrote in the media as a professor, I was credited simply because I said what everybody knew. So there's really not that much new. I just wrote it up and drew some charts and diagrams to spell it all out. What Wall Street knows today, but what it's not saying in the media, is we're in for a slow crash. It's not going to be necessarily a crisis. It's going to be people are getting poorer and poorer and poorer as they have to spend more and more money to pay the banks, to pay the insurance companies. Now Germany's going to face rising real estate. The Americans are coming in, and other investors, even Russian investors, and buying the real estate. And they're going to raise the rents very sharply on Germans. And they're going to try to turn Germany into another Greece. That is the intention of investors. If they can turn Germany into Greece, if they can impoverish the German population, they'll get rich. And they'll call that an increase in GNP. An increase, and they'll say this is progress. And progress means that it's their progress, but for the rest of the economy, it's being turned into neo-feudalism. So the economy is going to get poorer and poorer and poorer until finally we're in a new kind of dark ages. This has all happened before. About a month ago, David and Graeber and I were in Tübingen, and there was a discussion about the Roman Empire and what happened after it. And we were told that economists no longer call the Dark Ages, because actually there was a lot of trade. there was a lot of luxury spending, and we can find the trade. It was all in luxuries. Some people are living very well, and they've decided that GDP actually went up. So at the same time that the population was reduced to serfdom, GDP was going up. Well, that's what's happening today. GDP is going up, but people are in a worse and worse condition, a slow crash, until they make a decision, we're going to write down the debts. Now, this is not a left-wing or a right-wing issue. The left wing has not talked about debt. They've talked about labor's working conditions. They've talked about women's rights. They've talked about LGBTQ. They've talked about all sorts of hyphenated Americans and hyphenated Germans and hyphenated Europeans. But it seems that only the right wing is talking about the debt problem. That seems remarkable. Whereas 100 years ago, if you look, what did the German Social Democratic Party used to say? It was talking about raising living standards. It wasn't talking about privatization. It was talking about how does the government serve the economy by providing more goods and services to the population at large. The social democratic parties and the Labour Party in England and the Democratic Party in the United States have all now turned to the exact opposite of what they were 100 years ago. And the result is that you have the left-wing parties now moving to the right, and only the right-wing parties are talking, and the conservatives are, and Wall Street, my gang, are talking about finance and the financial stranglehold on economies.